Let's see. Ah, that accounts for it, said the Hatter. He won't stand beating. Now, if you only kept it on good time, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were not just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock. 1:30, time for dinner. I only wish it was, the March Hare said to her. That would be grand, certainly, said Alice thoughtfully, but then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know. Not at first, perhaps, said the Hatter, but you could keep it past 1 as long as you liked. Is that the way you managed? Alice asked, head mournfully. Not I, he replied. We quarrelled last month just before no, pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare. It was at the great concert given arts, and I had to sing, Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how what you're at. You know the song, perhaps? I've heard something like it, said it goes on, you know. The Hatter continued in this way. Up above the world, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, he gets up and began singing in its sleep. Twinkle, 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 twinkle. On and went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop. Well, I should the first verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen bawled out, He's murdering the time! Off! How dreadfully savage! Exclaimed Alice. And ever since the Hatter went on in a mournful tone, You won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock. A bright idea came into Alice's head. Is that the reason so many tea things are? She asked. Yes, it is, said the Hatter with a sigh. It's always tea time to wash the things between whiles. And you keep moving round, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, said the Hatter, as the things get used up. But when you come to the beginning, I ventured to ask. Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted, yawning. I'm tired of this. I vote the young lady tell us a story. I'm afraid I don't know one, rather alarmed at the proposal. Then the Dormouse shall, they both cried. Dormouse, and they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened. I wasn't asleep, he said in a hoarse, feeble voice. I heard every word you fellows were saying. Sorry, said the March Hare. Yes, please do, pleaded Alice. And be quick about it. I'll be asleep again before it's done. Once upon a time there was sisters. The Dormouse began in a great hurry. And their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, and they, well, what did they live on? Said Alice, who always liked took great interest in questioning and questions of eating and drinking. They lived on the Dormouse after thinking a minute or two. They couldn't have done that, you know, Alice. They'd have been ill. So they were, said the Dormouse. Very ill. Quite a little to fancy to herself what such an living would be like, but it puzzled her too much as she went on. Why did they go well? Take some more tea, the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly. I had nothing yet, Alice replied in an offended tone, so I can't take more. You mean you can't take less, said the Hatter. It's very more than nothing. Nobody asked your opinion, said Alice. Who's making pearl now? The Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated, Why did they live at the bottom of a well? The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then said, It was a treacle well. No such thing. Alice was beginning very angry, but the Hatter and and the Dormouse sulkily remarked, If you can't be civil, you just tell the story for yourself. No, please go on, Alice said very humbly. You again, I dare say there may be one. One indeed, said the Dormouse. However, he consented to go on. And so these three little sisters, they know, what did they draw? Said Alice, quite forgetting her promise. Treacle, said the Dormouse, considering it all this time. I want a clean cup, interrupted the Hatter. Let's move one place on. He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from? You can draw water out of a water hatter, so I should think you could draw treacle out of a treacle well, eh, stupid? They were in the well, Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice his last. Of course they were, said the Dormouse. Well in. This confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting. They were learning to draw, the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing his eyes, for it was getting very slow. And they drew all manner of things, everything that begins with an M. Why with an M? Why not? Said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse was by the time, and was going off into a doze, but on being pinched by the hag again with a little shriek, and went on. That begins with an M. Traps and the moon and and memory and muchness. You know you are much of a muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as drawing of a... Really, now you ask me, said Alice, very much confused. I don't think then, said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear, so she got up and walked off. The Dormouse fell silent instantly, and neither of the others noticed of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call out. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. I didn't go there again, said Alice as she picked her way through the wood. It's the stupidest tea was in all my life. Just as she said this, she noticed that one of these had a door leading right into it. That's very curious, she thought, but everything's... I think I might as well go in at once. And in she went. Once more she had a long hall and close to the little glass table. Now I'll manage better this time, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. She set to work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket to put high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at the beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. 8. The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it busily. Alice thought this a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. As she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, Five! Don't go splashing paint over." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. 7 jogged my elbow, and looked up and said, "That's right, Five. Always lay the blame on others." "You'd better," said Five. "I've heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" spoken first. "That's none of your business, too," said 7. "Yes, it is his, Five, and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook's tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brush and had just begun. Well, of all the onions, when his eyes chanced to fall upon Alice, as she stood watching them, and he checked himself. The others looked around also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell us a little timidly why you are painting those roses?" 5 and 7 looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice. "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, there ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake. The Queen was to find it out. We should all have our heads cut off. So you see, miss, we're doing our best, for she comes to," at this round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs shaped like the gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners, and courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, too, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. The little dears came jumping merrily along hand in hand in couples. They were all ornaments. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them our White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. And followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and last of all, this grand procession came the king and prince. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. What would be the use of a procession, she thought, if people had all to lie down on their so that you couldn't see it? So she stood to where she was and waited. The procession came opposite to Alice. They all stopped and looked at her, and the queen said severely, she said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. Idiot! Tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, What's your name, child? My name is Alice, so please your majesty, said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, A pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them. And who are these? Said the queen to 3 gardeners who were lying round the rose tree. For you see, as they were lying on, and the patterns on their backs were the same as the rest of the pack, she could not tell whether they were soldiers, or courtiers, or 3 of her own children. How should I know? Said her own courage. It's no business of mine. The queen turned crimson, with her glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, began screaming, Off with her head! Off with it! Said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the queen was silent. Laid his hand upon her arm, and timidly said, Consider, my dear, she is only. The queen turned angrily away from him and said to the knave, Turn them over. Very carefully, with 1 foot. Get up, said the queen in a shrill, loud voice. The nurse instantly jumped up and began bowing to the king, the queen, the royal children, and every. Leave off that, screamed the queen. You make me giddy. And then, turning to the rose tree, she went, Have you been doing here? May it please your majesty, said two in a very humble, going down on one knee as he spoke. We were trying. I see, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. Off with there, and the procession moved on. 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardener ran to Alice for protection. You shan't be beheaded, said Alice, and she put them in a flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or two, looking for them, and they marched off after the others. Are their heads off? Shouted the queen. If it please your majesty, the soldiers shouted in reply. That's right. Can you play croquet? The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question meant for her. Yes, shouted Alice. Come on, then, roared the queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day, voice at her side. She was walking by the white rabbit, who was peeping anxious. Yes, said Alice. Where's the Duchess? Hush, hush, said the rabbit in a low tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself up, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, She's under sentence of execution. For, said Alice. Did you say, what a pity? The rabbit didn't, said Alice. I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, what for? She boxed ears. The rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. Hush! The rabbit frightened tone. The queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the queen says, shouted the queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about, tumbling up against each other. However, they all settled down in a minute or two and began. Alice had seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away under her arm with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had gracefully straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself and look up into her face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help bursting out loud. And when she had got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very plain that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or a furrow where she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and as the doubled-up soldier was always walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult deed. The players all played at once, without waiting for turns, quarreling all the time for the hedgehogs. and in a very short time the queen was in a furious passion and went shouting, "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" about once in a minute. To feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute, but she knew that it might happen any minute. And then, thought she, what would become? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way to escape, and wondering whether she could be being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin. "It's the Cheshire cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to." "How," said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. And the eyes appeared, and then nodded. "It's no use speaking to it," she thought, "till it come, or at least one of them." In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think all fairly," Alice said, in rather a complaining tone, "and they all quarrel so can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular, if nobody attends to them. And you've no idea how confusing it is it is being alive, for instance. There's the arch I've got to go through next, walking into the ground, and I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran all mine coming." "How do you like the Queen?" said the cat in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" But just then she noticed the Queen behind her, listening, so she went on, "Likely to win, that it's hardly well finishing the game." The Queen smiled and passed on. "You, who are you talking to?" said the King, coming up to Alice and looking at the cat with curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat," said Alice. "Allow me to—" "I don't like the looks of it at all," said the King. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes," the cat remarked. "Don't be impertinent," said the King, "and don't look at—" He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at a king," said "I read that in in some book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must have," said the King very decidedly, and he called to the Queen, who was passing at the moment. "I wish you would have this cat removed." The Queen had only one small difficulty, great or small. "Off with his head!" without even looking round. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the King eagerly, and he hurried. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard the sentence three of the players to being executed for having missed their turn, and she did not like it all, and the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went off in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for coping one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up into it. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back to the fight, the fight was over, and both the hedgehogs were out of sight. "But it doesn't matter much that all the arches are gone from this side of the ground." So she tucked it away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she would find quite a large crowd collected round it. There was a dispute going on between her, the cat, and the Queen, who were all talking at once, while all were silent and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all three to settle the question, and they repeated their argument to her. They all spoke at once. She found it very hard to make out exactly what they said. The argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it from, that he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at this. The King's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that nonsense. The The Queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in no time, she'd have everybody executed all round. It was this last remark that the party looked so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say but, "You'd better ask her about it." "She is in prison," the Queen said to the executioner at once, and the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head away the moment he was gone, and by the time he had come back with the Duchess, it had disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it. He went back to the game. Chapter 9. The Mock Turtle's Story. "You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing," said the Duchess as she tucked her arm of Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper to herself that perhaps it was only the pepper that had made her so savage when they met in the kitchen. "I'm a duchess," she said to herself, not in a very hopeful tone, though. "I won't have any at all. Soup does very well without. Maybe it's always pepper that's tempered." She went on, very much pleased at having found out a new kind of rule: vinegar that makes them sour, and chamomile that makes them bitter, and barley and such things that make children sweet-tempered. I only wish people knew that, and they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know. She had quite forgotten the Duchess, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. "You're thinking about something, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is. Remember it in a bit." "Perhaps it hasn't one," Alice ventured to remark. "Tut, tut," the Duchess. "Everything's got a moral, if only you can find it." And she squeezed her Alice aside as she spoke. Alice did not much like her keeping so close to her, because the Duchess was very ugly, and secondly, because she was exactly the right height to rest on his shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she did not like it, so she bore it as well as she could. "The game's going on rather better now," she said, keeping up the conversation a little. "'Tis so," said the Duchess, "but it's done by minding their own business." "Ah, well, it means such the same thing," the Duchess, digging her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder as she added, "and the moral of that is, of the sense, and the sounds will take care of themselves." How fond morals and things, Alice thought to herself. "I dare say you're wondering why I don't round your waist," said the Duchess after a pause. "The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper. Shall I try the experiment?" "You might bite," Alice cautiously replied, not anxious to have the experiment tried. "Very true," said the Duchess. "Flamingos bite, and the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together." "Only mustard isn't," Alice remarked. "Right as usual," said the Duchess. "What a clear way you have of putting things." "It's a mineral, I think," said Alice. "Of course it is," said the Duchess, who seemed to agree to everything that Alice said. "There's a large mustard mine near here, and the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours." "I know," exclaimed Alice, who had not attended to this last remark. "It's a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is." "I quite agree with you," said the Duchess, "and the moral of that is you would seem to be, or, if you like it put more simply, yourself to be otherwise than what it might appear to others, that what you were or might have been was no otherwise than what you have been to them to be otherwise." "I think I should understand that better," politely, "if I had written it down, but I can't quite follow it as you say it." "To what I could say if I chose," the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. "Trouble yourself to stay any longer than that," said Alice. "Oh, I don't talk about it," said the Duchess. "I make you a present of everything I've said as yet." "A present," thought Alice. "I'm glad they don't have birthday presents like that." But she did not then aloud. "Thinking again?" the Duchess said, with another dig at her sharp little chin. "I've a right to think," said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to worry. "Just about as much right," said the Duchess, "as pigs have to fly." And here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away, even in the middle of her moral, and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked. There stood the Queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. "A fine day, your Majesty," the Duchess began in a low, weak voice. "Give you fair warning," shouted the Queen, stamping on the ground as she spoke. "Either your head must be off, and that is about half no time. Take your choice." She took her choice and was gone in a moment. "Let's go on with the game." The Queen and Alice was too much frightened to say a word, but slowly followed her back to the croquet. The other guests had taken advantage of the Queen's absence and were resting in the shade. The moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game, the Queen merely remarking that a moment cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the Queen never left off players and shouting, "Off with his head," or "Off with her head." Those whom she sentenced to custody by the soldiers, who of course had to leave off being archers to do this, so that by an hour or so there were no archers left, and all the players except the king, the queen, in custody and under sentence of execution. When the queen left breath and said to Alice, "Have you seen the mock turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "It's the thing mock turtle soup is," said the Queen. "I never saw one or heard of one," said Alice. "Come on, then," said the Queen. "I'll tell you his history." As they walked off together, Alice heard the King's voice to the company generally. "You are all pardoned. Come, that's all," she said to herself, for she felt quite unhappy at the number of executions the Queen had. They were very soon upon a griffin, lying fast asleep in the sun. If you don't know what a griffin is, look at the picture. Okay. I don't see a picture to show you, although I seem to remember that there is one. Oh well. "Up, lazy thing," said the Queen, "and take this young lady to see the mock deer his history. I must go back and see after some executions I have ordered." And she walked, leaving Alice alone with the griffin. Alice did not quite like the look of the creature, but I thought it would be quite as safe to stay with it as to go after that, so she waited. The griffin sat up and rubbed its eyes. Then it watched the Queen till she... Then it chuckled. "What fun," said the griffin, half to itself, half to Alice. Said Alice. "Why, she," said the griffin. "It's all her fancy cutes anybody. They never executes nobody, you know. Come on." "Everybody here," thought Alice as she went slowly after it. "I never was ordered about before, and I never." They had not gone far before they saw the mock turtle sitting sad and lonely on a little ledge of rock. And as they came nearer, Alice sighing as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply. "What is his?" said the griffin, and the griffin answered very nearly in the same words as before. "It's all his fancy, that's got no sorrow, you know. Come on." So they went up to the mock turtle, who looked with large eyes full of tears, but said nothing. "This here young lady," said the griffin, "is to hear. She wants for you to know. She wants forestry, she do." "I'll tell her," said the mock turtle in a deep, hollow tone. "On both of you, and don't speak a word till I've finished." So they sat down for some minutes. Alice thought to herself, "I don't see how he can ever finish again," but she waited patiently. "Once," said the mock turtle with a deep sigh, "I was a real turtle." These words were followed by a long silence, broken only by an occasional exclamation of "Crack!" and the constant heavy sobbing of the mock turtle. Alice was very nearly getting up and thank you, sir, for your interesting story, but she could not help thinking there must be more, so she sat still and said nothing. "When we were little," the mock at last, more calmly, though still sobbing a little now and then, "we went to ski. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise." "Call him Tortoise if he wasn't one," Alice said. "We called him Tortoise because he taught us," said the mock turtle angrily. "Really, you are very dull." You ought to be ashamed of such a simple question, added the Gryphon, and then they both sat silent and looked at poor Abby sink into the earth. At last the Gryphon said to the Mock Turtle, "Old fellow, don't be all day about it." And he went on in these words: "Yes, we went to school in the sea, though you mayn't believe it." "I never said I did, Alice." "You did," said the Mock Turtle. "Hold your tongue," added the Gryphon. "Speak again." The Mock Turtle went on. "We had the best of education. In fact, we went to school every day." "I've been to school, to-day school too," said Alice. "You needn't be so proud as all that." "With extra?" asked the Mock Turtle a little anxiously. "Yes," said Alice. "We learned French and music." said the Mock Turtle. "Certainly not," said Alice indignantly. "Ah, then you're really good school," said the Mock Turtle in a tone of great relief. Now, as they had at the end of the bill French, music, and washing. "You couldn't have wanted it much," said Alice, "living at the bottom of the sea." "To learn it," said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. "I only took the regular course." "That?" inquired Alice. "Reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with," replied, "and then the different branches of arithmetic: ambition, distraction, and derision." "I never heard of uglification," Alice ventured to say. "What is it?" The Gryphon added up both his paws in surprise. "Never heard of uglification!" he exclaimed. "It's what to beautify is, I suppose." "Yes," said Alice doubtfully. "It means to make everything—" "Well, then," the Gryphon went on, "if you don't know what is, you are a simpleton." Alice did not feel encouraged any more questions about it, so she turned to the Mock Turtle and said, "What else had—" "Well, there was mystery," the Mock Turtle replied, counting in his flappers. "Mystery, ancient and modern, with seaography, drawing." The drawing master was an old conjurer that used to come once a week. He taught us drawing, stretching, and foils. "What was that like?" said Alice. "Well, I can't show it to yourself," said the Mock Turtle. "I'm too stiff, and the Gryphon never learned it." Said the Gryphon. "I went to the classical master, though. He was an old crab, he was." "I never went to him," the Mock Turtle said with a sigh. "He taught laughing, I used to say." "So he did, said the Gryphon's turn, and both creatures hid their faces in their paws. "And how many hours a day?" said Alice, in a hurry to change the subject. 10 hours the first day, 9 the next, and so on." "What a curious plan!" exclaimed Alice. "The reason they're called lessons," the Gryphon remarked, "because they lesson from day to day." This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark. "The 11th day must have been a holiday." "Of course it was," said the Mock Turtle. "And how did you manage?" Alice went on eagerly. "That's enough about lessons," the Gryphon interrupted in a very tone. "Tell her something about the games now." Chapter 10. Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flapper across it. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a moment or two sobs choked his voice. "Same as if he had a bone in his throat," said the Gryphon, and it set to work shaking him in the back. At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and, with tears running down, went on again. "You may not have lived much under the sea." "I haven't," said Alice. "Never even introduced to a lobster," Alice began to say. "I once tasted, but checked and said, 'No, never.'" "So you can have no idea what a delight Mr. Quadrille is." "No, indeed," said Alice. "What sort of a dance is it?" said the Gryphon. "You first form into a long line along the seashore," cried the Mock Turtle. "Seals, turtles, salmons, and so on. And then when you've cleared all out of the way—" "That generally takes some time," interrupted the Gryphon. "You advance twice. Lobster as a partner," cried the Gryphon. "Of course," the Mock Turtle said. Set to partners, change lobsters, and retire in some order, continued the Gryphon. Oh, the Mock Turtle went on. You throw the lobsters, shouted the Gryphon with a bound, and tear out to sea as you can. Swim after them, screamed the Gryphon. Turn in the sea, cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about. Change lobsters again, the top of his voice. Back to land again, and that's all the first figure, said the monkey, dropping his voice, and the two creatures, who had been jumping about like mad things all this time, again very sadly and quietly, and looked at Alice. It must be very pretty, Alice timidly. Would you like to see a little of it? Said the Mock Turtle. Very much indeed, said Alice. Come, let's try the first figure, said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon. We can do it without lobsters, you know. Oh, you sing, said the Gryphon. I've forgotten the words. So they began dancing round and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close, and waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang very slowly and sadly. Will you walk a little faster, said the Whiting to us. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how early the lobsters in the dance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you join the dance? Will you, won't you join the dance? You know motion, how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us with to sea. But the snail replied, too far, and gave a look askance. Said he thanked me, but he would not join the dance. Would you, could you, dance? Would you, could not join the dance? Oh, what matters is how far we go, his scaly friend replied. There's another shore, you know, upon the other side, the farther off from England, the further nearer. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance. Will you join the dance? Will you, won't you join? Thank you, it's a very interesting dance to watch, said Alice, feeling very glad that it was lost. And I do so like that curious song about the whiting. Oh, as said the Mock Turtle, you've seen them, of course. I've often seen them didn't she? Checked herself hastily. I don't know where said the Mock Turtle, but if you've seen them so you know what they're like. I believe so, Alice replied thoughtfully. They open their mouths and they're all over crumbs. You're wrong about the crumbs, said the Mock Turtle. Crumbs would all wash off in the sea, but they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is, the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes. Tell her about the reason and all that, he said. The reason is, said the Gryphon, that they won't go with the lobsters to the dance, thrown out to sea. So they had to fall a long way. So they got their mouths. So they couldn't get them out again. That's all. Thank you. Very interesting. I never knew so much about whiting before. I care about that if you like, said the Gryphon. Do you know why it's called a whiting? What about it? Alice said. Why? It does the boots, the Gryphon replied very solemnly. Alice was thoroughly puzzled. Does the boots, she replied in a wondering tone. Why, what are your shoes done? I mean, what makes them so shining? Alice looked down at them and considered before she gave her answer. They're done with blacking, I believe. Boots indeed, said the Gryphon. The Gryphon went on in a deep voice, are done with now you know. And what are they made of? Alice asked in a tone of great. Soles and eels, of course, the Gryphon replied, rather impatient. Shrimp could have told you that. If I'd been the whiting, said Alice, whose thoughts were on the song, I'd have said to the porpoise, keep back, please. We don't want you with us. They were obliged to have him with them. The Mock Turtle said, no wise fish would go in a porpoise. Wouldn't it really? Said Alice in a tone of great surprise. Of course not. Why, if a fish came to me and told me he was going on a journey, I should think. Don't you mean purpose? Said Alice. I mean what I say, replied in an offended tone, and the Gryphon added, come, let's hear about your adventures. I could tell you my adventures, beginning from this morning, said Alice, a little timid, but it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then. Explain all that. No, no, the adventures first, said the Gryphon in an impatient tone. Explanations take such a dreadful time. So Alice began telling them her adventure when she first saw the White Rabbit. She was a little nervous about it at first. The two creatures to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide, they gained courage as she went on. The listeners were perfectly quiet till she got to the part about "You are old, Father William," to the caterpillar, and the words all came different, coming different. Then the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said, "That's very curious." "It's all as it can be," said the Gryphon. "It all came different," the Mock Turtle repeated. "I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin." He looked as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice. "Stand up and repeat, "'Tis of the sluggard,'" said the Gryphon. How the creatures order one about and make one lessons, thought Alice. I might just as well be at school at once. Helen began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the lobster quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying. It became very queer indeed. "'Tis the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "Me too brown, I must sugar my hair. As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose, his belt, and his buttons, and turns out his toes." "That's different from what I used to say," said the Gryphon. "Well, I never heard it before," said the Mock Turtle, "but it sounds common nonsense." Alice said nothing. She had sat down again, with her face in her head. Anything would ever happen in a natural way again. "I should like to have it explained, Turtle." "She can't explain it," said the Gryphon hastily. "Go on with the next verse." "About his toes," the Mock Turtle persisted. "How could she turn them out with, you know?" "It's the first position in dancing," Alice said, but she was rather dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing, and longed to change the subject. "Go on with the next verse," the Gryphon repeated impatiently. "It begins, 'I passed by his garden.'" She did not dare to disobey, though she felt sure it would all come wrong, and she went to her voice. "I passed by his garden, and marked with one eye how the owl and the oyster lie." "What is the use of repeating all that stuff?" said the Mock Turtle. "If you don't explain it as you, it's by far the most confusing thing I ever heard." "Yes, I think you'd better leave off," said the Gryphon, was only too glad to do so. "Shall we try another figure on the lobster quadrille? Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you a song?" "Oh, a song, please, of the mock kind," Alice replied, so eagerly that the Gryphon said in a rather offended tone, "No accounting for tastes. Sing her turtle soup, will you, old fellow?" The Mock Turtle and began in a voice sometimes choked with sobs to sing this: "Beautiful, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen, who for such day not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup, soup of the beautiful soup, beautiful soup, beautiful soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup, beautiful soup, who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not else for two for pennyworth soup, pennyworth only of beautiful soup, beautiful soup, beautiful soup, soup of the evening, beautiful soup." "Chorus again," cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to read. The cry of "The trial's beginning" was heard in the distance. "Come on," taking Alice by the hand, it hurried off without waiting for the end of the song. "What is this?" Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered, "Come on," and ran the fast. More and more faintly came, carried on the breeze that follows them, the melancholy evening. Beautiful, beautiful soup. I'm going to stop for a moment. I will be right back. Thanks for waiting. I am back. Chapter 11. Who Stole the Tarts? The King and the Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chamber on each side to guard them, and near the king was the white rabbit with a trumpet in one hand, and in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. It looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. Wish they'd get the trial done, she thought, and hand round the refreshments. But there's a chance for this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to see the name of nearly everything there. There's the judge, she said to herself, great wig. The judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore the wig, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming. It's the jury box, thought Alice, and those 12 creatures, she was obliged to say creatures, you see. Some of them were animals, and some were birds. I suppose they are the jurors. She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it. She thought, and rightly so, that very few little girls of her age knew that at all. However, jurymen would have done just as well. The 12 were all writing very busily on slates. What are they doing? Alice whispered to the Gryphon. They can't be put down yet, before the trial's begun. They're putting down their names, the Gryphon whispered in reply, for fear they should forget at the end of the trial. Stupid things, Alice began in a loud, indignant voice. Herself hastily, for the white rabbit cried out, Silence in the court! And the king put on his and looked anxiously around to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well